Madam Speaker. I appreciate the opportunity that this debate provides to discuss the important issue of stakeholder capitalism. Now, fundamental to our current economic system has been the idea of shareholder capitalism, the idea that corporations exist for the specific and narrow purpose of maximizing value for their shareholders. I think it is important to acknowledge that there are legitimate criticisms of this shareholder capitalism model. When companies only consider the interests of their shareholders, they may end up doing harm to non-shareholders. Questions of morality and long-term sustainability are part of the equation in shareholder capitalism insofar as they impact a company's reputation and bottom line, but insofar as they do not impact the bottom line, they are excluded from consideration. And maybe that presents a problem. Historically, we have tried to address these harms associated with shareholder capitalism through law, regulation, and tax policy that forces companies to internalize social costs. Needless to say, those efforts are never perfect. One increasingly popular response to the potential problems with shareholder capitalism is the proposed alternative model of stakeholder capitalism. I will argue today that stakeholder capitalism is dangerous. It exacerbates the problems of shareholder capitalism and creates new problems of its own. Stakeholder capitalism is the idea that we should pursue an economic system in which companies seek to maximize value for all stakeholders instead of just their own shareholders. Now, on the face of it, the idea that companies should concern themselves with the social good instead of just their own bottom line is obviously intuitively appealing to many people. But we need to go beyond the superficial, nice-sounding platitudes that usually shape the defense of stakeholder capitalism to understand the substantive implications of this radical shift in thinking. To start with, it's important to understand the history of the idea. Stakeholder capitalism is a new name, but not a new model. In fact, the process of early European colonization was generally effected through large monopolistic companies that were granted charters to trade exclusively in certain areas, partially in exchange for commitments to undertake certain other non-economic actions that were perceived to be in the interests of the home state. The Hudson's Bay Company and the East India Company were early examples of stakeholder capitalism at work. These companies acted like governments when they were in the field, and they were protected in their undemocratic exercise of political authority by the fact that they took into consideration the interests of their chosen or assigned stakeholders. Of course, they didn't take into consideration the interests of all stakeholders, but neither do their modern equivalents. Today, one of the most prominent proponents of stakeholder capitalism is World Economic Forum founder Klaus Schwab. Stakeholder capitalism is the title of his most recent book and is explicitly endorsed in the Davos Manifesto. Here in Canada, Mark Carney is a leading advocate, and his book Values makes similar arguments to those made by Schwab. Schwab and Carney and the NDP member proposing this bill today have every right to advance a particular set of proposals about how they believe our economy should change. But we should talk about the fact that these ideas have significant unseen consequences. Generally speaking, though not always, the proponents of stakeholder capitalism come from the political left. The political left has a long track record of critiquing shareholder capitalism, but has generally done so in the context of a broader critique of corporate power. That critique has been that corporations should not be too powerful, because they can use their positions of power to exploit workers and to push agendas that may be contrary to the democratic will of the people. And this is actually a potentially good critique, and many modern conservatives would embrace it, adding as well that too powerful corporations can often use their power to subvert and undermine the market itself. Conservatives and past versions of left-wing parties have both critiqued powerful monopolistic corporations, but have disagreed about solutions. Left-wing parties have critiqued capitalism itself and pushed for greater state ownership, while conservatives have sought pro-competition and other forms of regulation to ensure that private enterprise can do its job without any single private company having enough power to distort the market or undermine the common good. Now, today, the parameters of the economic debate have dramatically changed. Today, many on the left no longer critique corporate power itself, but simply argue that corporations should be asked to champion progressive and woke causes. The political left now seems fine with large and powerful corporations, as long as those corporations are talking about climate change, racial inequality, and trans rights. The left is no longer talking about the problems of corporate power. It is talking about how to use corporate power. It is very telling that C-245 that we're debating tonight, a bill proposed by someone who is arguably one of the most left-wing members of this chamber, is talking about using corporate power instead of limiting corporate power. She's demonstrating that shift in thinking of left-wing parties. In particular, Bill C-245 proposes to use the Canada Infrastructure Bank, yes, a Crown corporation, as an ideological tool to shape the kinds of investments that are made in the private sector, and to do so with non-economic objectives in mind. And this is what stakeholder capitalism is all about, and has been about since the colonial era, the use of corporate power to advance ideological objectives that are distinct from stakeholder interests. I believe that modern conservatism must strongly make the case against the kind of stakeholder capitalism championed by this bill and by others. Modern conservatism must take up the arguments against corporate power and recognize that centralized corporate power can be just as dangerous when wielded on behalf of stakeholders as it can be when wielded on behalf of shareholders. We have to defend workers and defend one-person, one-vote democracy against the idea that corporate power brokers should be the ones defining collective values. This is not an unquestioning defense of shareholder capitalism, which requires appropriate controls. It's simply a recognition that the prevailing concept of stakeholder capitalism is worse. And broadly speaking, I would make three arguments against stakeholder capitalism. First, an emphasis on stakeholder values is often done insincerely as a branding exercise to mask a lack of real and substantive action on genuinely important issues. It can be used as a basis for claiming that public interest or anti-monopoly regulation isn't necessary, even while not moving substantially on the values that are claimed. On this point, I would like to challenge all corporations that have said Black Lives Matter to say the same about Uyghur lives. The NBA, among many others, has figured out that campaigning for racial justice in America is good for your bottom line, and campaigning for racial justice in China is bad for your bottom line. But those who only campaign for racial justice when it's good for their bottom line are not really for racial justice. Mark Carney, who I referred to earlier, got himself into some hot water for making and then walking back the dubious claim that the $500 billion asset management firm where he works is net zero. I think some members of this House would call that greenwashing. The prevalence of hypocrisy and its potential to distract from real action is one important critique of stakeholder capitalism. The second is that even when corporations are sincere about championing certain values, encouraging them to identify and then act in the best interest of stakeholders gives companies too much power to make decisions about the common good that they do not have the mandate to make and that are outside of their expertise. This House decided at one point to ban corporate and union donations to political parties. Why? Because we determined that corporations should not have a privileged ability to shape public conversations about the common good by funding certain candidates over others. It was recognized that corporations being able to throw their weight around in politics has a distorting effect on decision-making. But what is the point of banning corporate and union donations to political parties if we then allow and even encourage those same corporations to use their unique privileges to advance political positions in other ways, by requiring their employees to take courses on progressive ideology, pushing investments towards certain kinds of enterprises, or enjoying the privilege of limited liability while participating in explicitly political activities? I believe that decisions about the goods that a society pursues should be made through democratic competition and debate, not through corporate-directed stakeholder consultations that perpetuate corporate interests and power even when well-intentioned. The goods that a society prioritizes should be selected on a one-person, one-vote basis, not on a one-share, one-vote basis. Even the most generous-hearted corporations necessarily reflect the power of shareholders and management to aggregate feedback from their chosen stakeholders as they make decisions. A society in which large corporations identify stakeholder values and then push those values is functionally much less democratic than a society in which collective social priorities are identified through open and transparent democratic debate. And again, the corporatized nature of European colonialism should point us to the risks of excessive and unconstrained corporate power, even when corporations are supposed to be responding to certain non-economic, stakeholder-driven imperatives. Now, my final concern with the stakeholder capitalism model is about the way that it enables government to use corporate action to advance their objectives, which is very clear in this bill. Those with regulatory power over corporations can achieve a great deal through the power of suggestion. Corporations understand that they are less likely to face hostile regulation if they are on the same page as governments when it comes to non-economic matters. If the government tells social media companies to regulate speech or tells banks to deny banking services to certain kinds of people, then it is very much in the interest of those corporations to be helpful. Governments are doing this sort of thing more and more. Stakeholder capitalism provides the intellectual toolkit for governments to ask corporations to use their corporate power in a particular preferred way. In the process, by using corporate power to their advantage, governments can exercise far more power over people's lives than they would otherwise. When the government acts directly, they are subject to scrutiny and accountability mechanisms that do not apply to private corporations. By acting through corporations and using the power of suggestion, governments can achieve preferred outcomes with less scrutiny and accountability. In general, a world in which political and corporate leaders establish common values and use corporate power alongside state power to push them is less democratic than one in which business sticks to business and common values are identified through democratic debate and advanced by regulators through transparent regulation. In the process, we must preserve a healthy skepticism of corporate power and recognize that a functioning capitalist system is one in which no single player dominates the field. So instead of using the Canada Infrastructure Bank to push so-called stakeholder values, Conservatives believe that we should eliminate the Canada Infrastructure Bank, which has been a failure by any standard. This so-called bank already represents a perverse structure for combining government and corporate interests because it involves the taxpayer assuming the risks associated with private investment. The genius of a market system is that private actors must bear risk in proportion to their potential gains. The only thing worse than socialism is a policy that privatizes gains while still socializing.